Good evening, everyone, and welcome for the final time for this workshop. It's very nice to see you, and it's been very nice seeing you for these 2 weeks now. We're just going to start. I'm going to offer a short little prayer. Yeah, please join me in prayer. Good evening, dear beloved Heavenly Parents and true parents. We're gathering now for this online workshop hosted by Uncle William on Moses and the Israelites, lessons in leadership and community building. Yeah, what a journey it has been so far through history, through many thousands of years of history, through learning lessons, very meaningful and significant lessons from some of the greatest leaders, I guess, that we know of. And as it was mentioned in one of the days in these lectures, I think as we, let's say, as a spiritual community now, are called to be the new Israel, chosen people. It sounds very grand, but I just really hope that we can embody these things that we're learning now in our hearts and our minds, and really succeed and go even further. Write a new type of history that hasn't been written yet. There's so many lessons that we're learning here. How great it would be if we could slowly fix up things that we're doing not so well in our communities, or build upon this great foundation. And I'm really grateful that Uncle William is here to really point everything out and very skillfully and very wisely guide us through this, all these years and really all this accumulated history and lessons. So I'd like to offer this prayer now and open up this last day of the workshop. And my name is Andranik Karagazan, and all of our names here as brothers and sisters of Best Central Families G.
Gotcha.
Okay, so see, there's more people join. Welcome to those who just joined during the prayer. Very nice to see you all. Would be even nicer to see your cameras on and your wonderful faces. Just one little announcement before Uncle William prepares and turns on screen sharing. In the Zoom chat, again, we have the link put up for registering for a certificate. If you want to receive one that you can later print out for yourselves, the link is in the chat. Last workshop, it was a wonderful experience. So many of you registered, and you're so happy to receive it. Me and Sandra, we were very overwhelmed by the responses. It was such a wonderful experience. So I just really want to encourage everyone, to open up that link, register. It's the last chance today. So, yeah. And so with all that said, I'd like to pass on the virtual mic to Uncle William.
Thank you, Andranik. Welcome, everyone, for the last day of this workshop, Moses and Israelites. I'm not quite sure if we're going to get to the end. We haven't even started the 40 years yet, wandering in the wilderness. But let's see how we get on. So thank you all very much for joining me and everybody else this evening. And I'll share my screen as usual. All right, just to briefly go back and where we finished yesterday. This is one of the commands that Moses gave, an explanation about, I said, this is about leadership, community building. One of the biggest problems that happens with any community is when people get angry, resentful, and leads to conflict and separation, disunity. And we'll be looking at that in a moment as that develops more in the Israelite community. But also, as I talked about in the last workshop about family, then also we saw there a lot of this came up with sibling relationships. So just to recap this, do not hate your brother in your heart. So what Moses said, reprove or reason with your neighbor frankly, so you will not bear sin because of him. Do not seek revenge or bear a grudge against anyone among your people, but rather love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. And again, it's always, I am the Lord. Yeah, because it's always connected to God and worship of God, these things. So just to summarize from yesterday, if someone you believe has done you harm, in such a case, do not remain in a state of silent resentment. Do not give way to hate. Do not bear a grudge. And do not take revenge, as St. Paul also said in one of his letters. Instead, correct him, reason with him, tell him what you believe he has done and how you feel it has harmed you. Yeah, say to this person, what you said or what you did hurt. Yeah, I don't think it was the right thing to do. He may apologize and seek to make amends, as I said, any decent person would. Even if he does not, at least you've made your feelings known to him. That in itself is cathartic. It'll help you to avoid nursing a grievance. At the end of the day, that is one's responsibility to do that. And at least the other person now knows what they've done. They're now aware of what they've done, and now it's their responsibility how they respond. But it also refers to someone you see acting wrongly, committing a sin or a crime. You may not be the victim. You may just be an observer. The command tells us not to be content with passing a negative judgment on his or her behavior, i.e. with hating him in your heart. It's very easy to do that, to be critical of someone, develop a bad opinion about somebody after you've seen them doing something. You must get involved instead, Moses says. You should approach him or her, pointing out in as gentle and constructive a way as you can, and that's really important. That what he's doing in a gentle, doing it in a loving way, that what he is doing is against the law, civil or moral. If you stay silent and do nothing, in other words, if you're just a bystander, you don't get involved for whatever reason, you will become complicit in his guilt, i.e. bear sin because of him. Because you saw him do wrong, you did nothing to protest. And this is in every single context, within our own spiritual community as well. We see somebody we think is abusing power or doing something which is wrong or corrupt. We should say something, again, in as gentle and constructive a way as possible, because again, the person may not realize that what they're doing is wrong. Otherwise, if you don't, then that's how evil thrives. There was an English, or Irish actually, a philosopher said, evil thrives when good people do nothing. And it's true. Yeah. When people who just want to seize power and get away with it because nobody stands up to them, then evil thrives and corruption prospers and ends up with tyranny. Okay, so this is where we were on the end yesterday. On the edge of Canaan, so they've been on a journey. It's taken them 21 months so far to get to this point. So the question is, are they ready to enter Canaan? Have they made the necessary psychological, social, cultural, and political transformation? So I said, what's going on here is not just going into Canaan in terms of the geography, it's about making a certain kind of transformation. They were slaves in Egypt, and to be able to be qualified to go and live in Canaan and establish what we would say is Chungoguk, they needed to make a certain kind of psychological, social, cultural, and political transformation and change. And, we looked at that before. Originally, God thought they could do it in 21 days. I don't think that was at all realistic. After 21 months, then they got to this point. The question is, were they ready to go in or not? This is the real question, were they ready to go in or not? It's a huge thing, a huge ask. And so what is Canaan? It's very much what we would call Chongaguk. So I'm not going to go through all of the verses in Chongaguk, but just a couple of them, just to have a look here. It's Chongaguk, you could say, is the realm of the family pledge. It's the place in which the family pledge is implemented. It's the place where the values embedded and embodied in the family pledge actually bear fruition in terms of social dimension, family dimension, political dimension, economic dimension. And so all these little sound bites we have here all need to be expanded, you might say. Anyway, so the most common expression, there's the two expressions repeated most often in the family pledge are as the owner of Chungoguk and centering on true love. So as the owner of Chungoguk, what does that mean? That very much means that We are the owners. If we're the owners of Chaguk, it means we're responsible for the way it is. And if anything goes wrong, we need to take ownership and fix it. There's a difference between owning your own house, and if the roof starts leaking, you have to fix it. Whereas if you're a tenant and the roof starts leaking, you phone up the landlord and get the landlord to come around and fix the roof. That's the difference. If you're a tenant and something goes wrong, you phone the landlord. If the landlord doesn't do anything, you complain. You start complaining about the landlord because he hasn't come and fixed my roof. Yeah, so that's not the heart of the attitude of an owner. So to be an owner then of our spiritual community, it means when we see something that's wrong, it means we need to get involved and change it to make it better in some way. And so that's why yesterday when somebody asked me which country in the world today most resembles Chungaguk, and I said Switzerland, because in Switzerland, everybody's involved in the decision-making process. And as Serena reminded us, or told us, every year, 4 times a year, they get a thick wad of papers through the letterbox. And they have to read, they're supposed to read all these letters and all this information because they have to vote upon different laws. Yeah, so that means they're the owner of their community, the owner of their canton, owner of their village, and all the decision making is decentralized as far as possible. That is the vision of Chungaguk, I would say. That is the country in the world today which most resembles the ideal in that sense, the most principled country in the world, I would say, in terms of its political, economic, social structures. Of course, like everywhere, it has its own problems and own issues and its own challenges. So our family, okay, the next pledges to, and it says here, perfect the world of freedom, peace, unity, and happiness by centering on true love. So again, these are sort of words which we've been looking at as we've been looking at the whole journey here, leadership and community building. It's the world of freedom. Yeah, we looked at that, the meaning of freedom. You're free within the law. Yeah, so that's why you have compassion and justice have to go together. You're free within the law. And that is what's necessary for there to be a peaceful society in which people, when we talk here about unity, we're not talking here about uniformity, but about unity as a measurement of our love. Yeah, we're united in heart. It doesn't mean we're all the same. And as a result of that, we experience joy and we, through love, are very happy. Again, so freedom then is an important word here. Again, the last one, our family, the owner Chungaguk, pleasures absolute faith, absolute love, and absolute obedience. So I looked at that when we looked at the last workshop, absolute faith. That means absolute, or absolute just means the highest. The highest faith is the highest trust in God and loyalty to God. So one trusts in God, one's loyal to God. But also absolute love, that's love for strangers, love for one's enemies, and absolute obedience. We looked at the meaning of the word obedience. It's about listening to one's conscience. So you absolutely listen to your conscience above everything else. And perfect the realm of liberation. Again, that's about freedom, yeah, from slavery into a realm of freedom. And complete freedom. It emphasizes yet again, this word freedom comes up 3 times in the family pledge. So apart from this phrase and this word and this phrase, freedom is the word repeated most often next in the family pledge. So complete freedom, not just limited freedom, complete freedom within the law, the freedom to pursue beauty, truth, and goodness, the freedom to be responsible, etc., the freedom to be able to realize the 3 blessings in the kingdom of God on earth and in heaven by centering on true love. So I said they're going on this journey then to realize, to Canaan, to establish Chungaguk. So it's a movement from slavery to freedom, from obedience, where they just do as they're told, to taking responsibility and living life of conscience. And the vision we looked at before was that God would be their king. And because God is invisible, that all have to live a spiritual life so they could be guided by God to work together and cooperate with each other. Okay, so standing here on the edge of Canaan, and they're wondering, well, what's Canaan like? And so Moses sends some scouts out. And in the Bible, in translation, people often talk about the 12 spies. But actually, the Hebrew is not spies. 7 times it says the word actually just means tourists. They're people there sent by Moses to go and look at the land and to see what it was like. And when you go as a tourist, you go to look at all the good things in the land. You go to see all the wonderful sights, all the tourist resorts, yeah, how beautiful it is, how wonderful it is. If you go as a spy, you go there to try and find all the weaknesses. You're just trying to look for weaknesses. Yeah. So they go there, and then after 40 days, they come back. They've been touring around the countryside, and they come back and they give their report, what it was like. And they said, we came to the land, it flows with milk and honey, and this is its fruit. So Moses told them, it'll be a land of milk and honey, but nobody been there. Moses had never been there. Nobody been there. They just heard that's what it was like. So they wanted other people to go there and to see and bring back objective, accurate reports of the reality. Yeah, the people who dwell in the land are strong and the cities are fortified. So it's a fairly accurate report. Then Caleb, one of the two who went on this scouting expedition, said, let us go up at once and occupy it, for we are well able to overcome it. Yeah, because remember what God has been doing with us for the past 21 months. Certainly we can do it. Whereas 10 of the others, they said, we're not able to go up against the people, for they are stronger than we are. So they brought to the people of Israel an evil report. And the people lamented, and they changed their mind. They said, let us choose a captain and return to Egypt. So only two of the tourists, Joshua and Caleb, argued against them. So you might wonder what's going on here. So as I said, Moses had told them the land was good. It was flowing with milk and honey. But as I said, Moses had never seen the land himself. So why should they believe him? They needed an independent testimony of eyewitnesses. And that was the mission of the 12 princes, 12 leaders of the tribes of Israel. They went there to bring back reports to all their tribes of what it was like. And they all fulfilled their mission in the sense they came back with an accurate report that it was a land flowing with milk and honey. But 10 of them thought their task was to be spies. They went on to say the conquest was impossible. In other words, they weren't looking for all the good things that were there. They were just spying out the land to see, are there any weaknesses? And when they looked at it, they saw all the cities are well fortified, all the people are very strong. And so they thought, these people are too strong for us. So they misunderstood what their mission was in that sense. They weren't being sent to spy it out. They'd just been sent there to bring back an accurate report of what the land was like, to confirm what Moses said the land was like. So the difference between the 10 and Joshua and Caleb is not that the latter had faith, courage, and confidence, the former did not. It's they understood the story, the 10 did not. So Caleb and Joshua, they understood what it was that Moses had asked them to go and do, which was to be, as it says in the Hebrew, tourists, to go and scout out the land, to bring back an accurate description about how it was. Yeah. Whereas the other 10, they didn't understand what it was that they were doing. They didn't understand the task at hand. They thought they were going there to spy out the land and to see what the weaknesses were. So they didn't get it. So it's all about, again, I've talked over and over again about the importance of narrative, the importance of story. So 10 of the 12 thought they were part of a story of espionage. The result was they looked for wrong things and they came to the wrong conclusion. Demoralized the people, destroyed the hope of an entire generation, and it'll be eternally remembered, Jonathan Sacks says, as responsible for one of the worst failures in Jewish history. This is Jonathan Sacks speaking here. I, Jonathan Sacks, write these words while the coronavirus pandemic is at its height. So he just wrote his commentary on this just a few months ago. Has anyone yet identified the narrative of which it and we are a part? I believe that the story we tell affects the decisions that we make. Get the story wrong, and we can rob an entire generation of their future. Get it right, as did Joshua and Caleb, and we can achieve greatness. So we look at the way the world is dealing with this coronavirus. I personally don't think it's dealing with it in the right way. I think people got spooked, they panicked, and I think in hindsight, in a few years' time, people realized the decisions that were made by the political leaders of most countries of the world actually were disastrous and led to social, spiritual, cultural, economic a catastrophe, really. This is what I said in March before the lockdown happened, and I got a lot of abuse for it. But basically, I think that's the way it is. Anyway, so what did God say? So Moses went and told God, and God was obviously pretty upset that the spy mission, the scouting mission hadn't been successful. And God said, "How long will his people despise me? I will strike them and disinherit them, and I'll make of you a nation greater and mightier than they." So again, Moses has been put in the same spot that he's put in when they built the golden calf. God is saying to Moses, look, this is a useless lot. I'll disinherit them, and I'll make of you a nation which is greater and mightier than they are. And again, Moses has to decide, how is he going to respond to this? So just as he did before, Moses replied, the Egyptians will hear about it. Think about your reputation, God. You're not going to go down in history as being a nice, kind, compassionate God if you go and destroy everybody that you brought out of Egypt. And then Moses said to God, do you remember when we had that little encounter on the Mount Sinai? Do you remember what you said to me? Do you remember I said to you, what are you like? And this is how you described and presented yourself. You said, the Lord is slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love, forgiving iniquity. And so Moses said, well, in that case, pardon the iniquity of this people. Otherwise, I'm out of here. Otherwise, I'm resigning. I don't want the job of leading another nation. Either you forgive the people unconditionally or I'm resigning. Yeah. And so God had to decide what's he going to do. Okay, so God says, all right, this is the deal. According to the number of days in which you spied out the land, 40 days, because they spied it out when they weren't supposed to be spying it out. 40 days, for every day a year, you shall bear your iniquity. 40 years, and you shall know my displeasure. And all those over 20 years old are going to die in the wilderness, and only those who were born in the wilderness, in that sense, will go. And you have to think, well, why is that? Isn't that really very, very harsh? Is that a harsh thing to do, or is that a sensible thing to do? And you have to think, if they've gone down into Egypt with this kind of mentality, this kind of mindset, they would have recreated a slave society within Egypt. Because it's very, very hard to cast off and to grow out and abandon the slave mentality and the slave kind of relationships, the slave kind of attitude to life. And so God realized it's better that they should just spend 40 years wandering around in the wilderness, so that the people who are born in the wilderness, who've grown up in an atmosphere of freedom, of worshiping God and living according to the law, taking responsibility and initiative, those are the people who should go into Canaan and create the kind of society which needs to be created in Canaan. It's much better to do that than to go into Canaan, recreate a slave society, and then try to reform that, which will take, well, who knows, hundreds of years or maybe never. Very, very hard to reform a slave society, really is, or totalitarian society. So in that sense, it's very, very practical. Anyway, there were some of them, they decided to enter Canaan immediately. They said, we're not going to wait. We're not going to hang around here for another 40 years wandering around in the desert. And so Moses said to them, don't go down. We're not strong enough just for this small group to go down. But anyway, they went down and they were defeated and wiped out. And this is kind of like a very difficult time. Then there was what's called Korah's rebellion. So you can imagine then, it's really difficult. All the people have been looking forward to going into Canaan, and then suddenly they're not going into Canaan. Suddenly they're going to have to spend another 40 years wandering around in the wilderness. And so a lot of people then, a lot of leaders who are very disgruntled, very unhappy with things, and they decided they didn't want to stand for this anymore, and they wanted to rebel, and they wanted to have a change of leadership. So this is Korah. So this is what it says. Korah rose up against Moses with 250 Israelite leaders. And they approached Moses and Aaron. They said, you've gone too far. The whole community is holy, every one of them, and the Lord is with them. Why then do you set yourselves above the Lord's assembly? On hearing this, Moses threw himself down face down on the ground. In other words, he bowed down in front of them. Yeah. He didn't act in a dictatorial way. He was a very humble person. He just bowed down in front of them. And then Moses said, listen well now, sons of Levi. That's Korah was one of the Levites. Isn't it enough for you that the God of Israel has selected you to bring you near him to serve in the sanctuary and to minister to the congregation? He's brought you and all your brother Levites into his inner circle, and now you're grasping for the priesthood too. What do you have against Aaron that you're bad-mouthing him? So let's, and then there were some other people, some other leaders said, this is Dathan and Abiram. They were the descendants of Reuben, who was the eldest son, oldest of the sons of Jacob. And normally the oldest son has the leadership, and they're very disgruntled because they weren't the leaders. Instead, Moses, who came from the tribe of Levite, was the leader. So Dathan Abiram said, isn't it enough that you yanked us out of the land flowing with milk and honey, Egypt? Yeah, was Egypt a land flowing with milk and honey? That's a lie. To kill us in the wilderness. And now you keep trying to boss us around. Face it, you haven't produced. You haven't brought us into a land flowing with milk and honey. You haven't given us the promised inheritance of fields and vineyards. And so Moses' temper blazed white hot. And he said to God, I haven't taken so much as a single donkey from them. I haven't heard a single hair of their heads. So you can imagine they'd also been accusing him of accumulating wealth and behaving like a bully and everything. And then Moses said, this is how you'll know the Lord has sent me to do all these things, that it was not my idea. So let's analyze this a little bit. What's Korah and co? What do they want? If you want to understand why someone's very, very resentful, then listen to what they say. So you listen to what people accuse others of, and you'll then know what they themselves want. Because people often attribute to others the very things they want for themselves, the psychological process known as splitting and projection. So if we think about this, we've got Korah. He wanted to be the chief priest. He was Moses' cousin. And so he was objected to the fact that that Aaron, who is Moses' brother, had become the chief priest. And he thought basically Aaron and Moses were practicing nepotism, that instead of Moses keeping everything in the family with Aaron and Miriam, he felt actually because they shared the same grandfather, he also should have been the high priest instead. So he wanted to be the chief priest, and he was objecting to that. He felt he was senior to Moses. Yeah, Moses, wasn't the oldest son. Aaron was actually older than him. So Korah then, he wanted to do that. Then 250 leaders, they resented the fact that leadership had been taken from the 11 tribes and given to Levi. So this is what happened after the incident of the golden calf. So normally, each of the leaders of the 12 tribes would also be leaders. Yeah, but after that incident of the golden calf, then God said, work with the Levites, your own tribe. And so it was the Levites then who became the leadership. And so the leaders of all the other tribes, they were all important leaders, were very unhappy about this. Yeah. But the reality is the tribe of Levi, they were the only tribe that in Canaan wouldn't have any land. So, it's like swings and roundabouts. And then Dathan and Abiram, as I said, they were the tribe of Reuben. They resented that as they were descendants of the oldest son, they had no leadership position. So there are a lot of discontented people here. So you got this crisis situation, and then suddenly all the resentments, all the discontent came out. And so what are they trying to do here? So the rebels' aim, Sachs says, is to discredit Moses. They want to damage his credibility, raise doubts among the people, like accusing him of taking the grain, accusing him of corruption, accusing him of lording it over people, accusing him of making up laws, saying it wasn't all from God, actually you made up a lot of these laws yourself, as to whether he was really receiving his instructions from God, and so besmirch his character so that he'd be unable to lead the future, or at least be forced to capitulate to the rebels' demands. So when you're arguing for the sake of power, truth doesn't come into it at all. And that's what they wanted. They wanted to discredit Moses so that they could replace Moses and seize the power for themselves. That's what happens when people try to lead revolutions, when they try to lead rebellions. They're not arguing about truth. It's an argument, you try to discredit this person's character and personality so that you can take the power for yourself. So this is when you have an argument for this, this is an argument not for the sake of heaven. Okay, argument, anyway, this is Jonathan Sacks relating this to the world today. Argument not for the sake of heaven has resurfaced in our time in the form of cancel or call-out culture that uses social media to turn people into non-persons when they're deemed to have committed some wrong, sometimes genuinely so, sometimes merely for going against the moral fashion of the moment. And so you can see this with the cancel culture against people like J.K. Rowling, Jordan Peterson, all kinds of other people. They say things that people don't like. So instead of engaging with them in argument and discussion, people just label them, say, you're a racist, you're a Nazi, you're a fascist, you're a sexist, you're a transphobe, you're this, you're that, just putting people in a label, labeling them, putting in the box. And on that basis, you don't need to engage with their arguments. You don't need to reason with them. You can just cancel them and discredit them and make them a non-person. That's what's going on here. And the reason is because it's not arguing for truth. What is the truth of the matter? It's all about seizing power so that your opinions become the dominant opinions. Yeah, and the other people's opinions are eradicated. That's what's going on in the world today, and that's very much what was going on there in the time of Korah's rebellion. He was trying to discredit Moses, and so he could take power for himself. And that's what people are doing in the world today. You know, a lot of the stuff that you see going on, it's all about canceling people whose opinions a small minority of people disagree with, and because they can't win the argument based upon evidence, they just discredit people, cancel them, beat them up, censor them, and intimidate them. So there's a distinction here about arguing. So we see that the Judaism and the Bible is just one long argument. Abraham argues with God. Moses argues with God. It's just the whole of the Bible is about conversations. A lot of people arguing with each other. Jacob and Laban arguing, Leah and Rachel arguing. There's lots of arguing going on. So the question is, what is the nature of the argument? So there's an interesting distinction here. What is an argument for the sake of heaven? So this is from the Talmud. The argument between Hillel and Shammai. So Hillel and Shammai, they were two very, very famous rabbis who established two schools just before the time of Jesus. And these two rabbis were always arguing with each other. They were always arguing about everything. They never agreed with each other. Yeah. So this is often called an argument for the sake of heaven. And then, which is an argument not for the sake of heaven, the argument of Korah and his company. So we'll analyze that. So for 3 years, there was a dispute between the schools of Shammai and Hillel. The former claimed the law is in agreement with our views, and the latter insisted the law is in agreement with our views. So each of them insisted that their interpretation of the law was the correct one. Then a voice from heaven, God, spoke and said, "These and those are the words of the living God, but the law is in accordance with the school of Hillel." So what does that mean? These and those. In other words, the views of Shammai and the views of Hillel are both the words of the living God, even though they contradict each other. But the law is in accordance with the school of Hillel. So why would it be that God would say the law is in accordance with the school of Hillel? So this is the reason. In their debates, one of them would render a decision and the other would argue against it, out of a desire to discover the truth, not out of cantankerousness or a wish to prevail over his fellow, which is like cancel culture, it's about power. An argument not for the sake of heaven was that of Korah and his company, for they came to undermine Moses, our master, may he rest in peace, and his position out of envy, contentiousness, and ambition for victory. Oh yeah, I forgot to tell you. The reason why God said that the law is in accordance with the school of Hillel is because whenever the school of Hillel presented the law, they would always first present the view of Shammai. They'd always present the view of Shammai first, with respect and accurately, and then they'd present their own view. And then they'd allow everyone who is listening to understand both sides of the argument and then come to their own conclusion. And it's that which God liked. Yeah, it's not a question of which one was right. It was a question of which way did they argue. So they're both arguing to understand what is the truth. Yeah, but at the same time, one school respected the views of the other and one school didn't. And God said, the law is in accordance with the school of Hillel, because the school of Hillel, they present the views of their opponents first, and then they present their own views. Yeah. So this is completely different to what's going on here with Korah. So Korah and his company are not arguing with Moses. They just want to cancel Moses and discredit him, attacking the person and the personality, not the views. Anyway, so God then gets a bit fed up with this. And God says to Moses and Aaron, separate yourselves from this congregation so I can finish them off and be done with them and start all over again with another nation. This whole thing is going on. And so again, Moses is challenged. What's he going to do? Suddenly, all the major leaders amongst the people of Israel have come against him. Yeah. It's not just God saying, I'm going to wipe them out because they brought bad reports from Canaan. Now all the Israelites themselves are standing and opposing Moses. And you can imagine the stress of this kind of situation when all the leadership of all the tribes is now confronting Moses. Yeah. And so God says to Moses and Aaron, I'm going to wipe them out. What do Moses and Aaron do? They throw themselves on their faces and said, oh God, God of everything living, when one man sins, are you going to take it out in the whole community? Where did they get that little verse from? Abraham. Exactly what they're just repeating what Abraham said to God. Yeah, standing on Abraham's covenant. So Moses then called upon God, said, okay, God, all right, only the guilty should be punished. So Moses said to God, make the earth swallow Korah and the rebels. And so the earth swallows up Korah and the 250 leaders and all their followers and family, and they all get swallowed up. Anyway, you might think that settled the argument, but actually the reality is the argument was not settled. Next morning, grumbling broke out the next day in the community of Israel, grumbling against Moses and Aaron. They said to Moses and Aaron, you have killed God's people. In other words, you can't settle an argument like that. You ask God to do a miracle and to settle his argument with force. That's not fair. That's not just. That's not the way we want arguments settled. Yeah. So they said to Moses and Aaron, you've killed God's people. That's not right. Yeah. Again, it's extraordinary. They decided they didn't want to be governed by force. They didn't want to be governed by dictators. Even if it was Moses, even if it's God, they weren't going to allow God to use force to settle an argument. Yeah. They had enough of that in Egypt. So the community got together against Moses and Aaron. So this is not just the leaders, this is all the people then get together against Moses and Aaron. So, okay, so God then intervenes, and God spoke to Moses and said, back away from this congregation so I can do away with them this very minute. Yeah. So again, the same thing, same challenge. And again, Moses and Aaron threw themselves on the ground in front of God and said, don't do it. Don't do it. And again, God relented. And then God spoke to Moses and said, speak to the people of Israel, get staffs from them, 12 staffs in all, one from the leader of each of their ancestral tribes. Write each man's name on the staff. Now lay them out in the tent of the meeting in front of the testimony where I keep appointments with you. Amazing, where they make an appointment to meet God. What will happen next is this. The staff of the man I choose will sprout. I'm going to put a stop to this endless grumbling by the people of Israel against you. And then Aaron's staff sprouted and flowers came out and fruit. And that put an end to the argument. Yeah. And so it's like a different way of settling the argument that God came up with, realizing force isn't the way to do it. Actually, you have to find a better way, to settle this kind of argument. Kind of lots of interesting things. So basically, this is the commentary on this whole story. What the rebels wanted was they attributed to Moses and Aaron a form of leadership unknown in the Torah and radically incompatible with the value Moses embodied, which was humility. Over and over again, I think 30 times or so, Moses is called a humble man. Yeah. They were the ones who wanted to set themselves above the Lord's assembly. They accused Moses of setting himself above the Lord's assembly, but actually that's what they wanted to do. They wanted to be the rulers. And they accused Moses of lording it over the people. That's what they wanted to do. They wanted power. We saw again and again and again, when Moses confronted, he just bows down in humility, tries to get the people not to do that. As much as he can, he does that. So what do you do when you speak? You seek not truth but power. You attack the message, not the message but the messenger. You attempt to destroy the standing credibility of those you oppose. You attempt to devoice your opponents. And that's what Korah and his fellow rebels tried to do. Okay. Yeah, so as I said, it's about when an argument's undertaken, how it is conducted is very important. An argument not for the sake of heaven is one that is undertaken for the sake of victory. So sometimes people engage in argument because they want to win the argument. An argument for the sake of heaven is undertaken for the sake of truth. When the aim is victory, as it was in the case of Korah, both sides are diminished. Korah died because he and his followers were swallowed up, but also Moses' authority was tarnished because he won this argument through calling upon God to swallow them up. He used force to win the arguments. It's a lose-lose kind of situation. Both sides lost. When the aim is truth, both sides gain. To be defeated by the truth is the only defeat that is also a victory. So if you have an argument for the sake of truth and you find out that actually your views and your arguments are incorrect, then you have the opportunity to get rid of your arguments which are not correct and to embrace and adopt better arguments. So you come closer to the truth. So when you lose an argument about truth, you actually win because you've been able to find a better understanding of the nature of reality than the one that you did before. You realize, oh, the way I understood things was actually wrong in some way. Now I have a better understanding. And so that one of the most helpful things actually is what is called a critical friend. Somebody who are willing to have the courage and the humility and the love to point out to you where your arguments are wrong, where you've got it wrong, to correct you. That's what it is, to love your neighbor. Yeah, reason with someone who hurts you, reason with somebody you think is wrong. Yeah, and that sense, oh, you've lost the argument, but that's great because you found out a better understanding of the nature of reality. You come closer to the truth than you were before. That's supposed to be the basis of the way science is supposed to work like that. It's supposed to work like that. Supposed to. When you look at all the scientific discussions going on about the coronavirus, you realize there's a lot of politics going on in here. Different scientists taking different sides, often for political reasons, and trying to discredit the other scientists for political reasons because they want to defend their own view of science. Yeah. Not all of us have power. So not everybody's got not everyone's the king. Obviously, you can only have one king at a time. Not everyone's a prime minister or a minister or a leader. Not all of us have power or position or authority in that way. Not all of us have power, but we all have influence. That is why we can each be leaders. The most important forms of leadership come not with position, title, or robes of office, not with prestige and power, but with a willingness to work with others to achieve what we cannot do alone. To speak, to listen, to teach, to learn, to treat others' people's views with respect, even if they disagree with you, to explain patiently and cogently why we believe what we believe and do what we do, to encourage others, to praise their best endeavors, to challenge them to do better still. Always choose influence rather than power. It helps change people into people who can change the world. So I remember when I was at high school, I remember one of my teachers, he was there, and he was an economics teacher, and he was quite old. And he said to me, you know, that person who's now the what do you call it? Not the Minister of Finance. Anyway, he's the Chancellor of the Exchequer in Britain. In other countries called Minister of Finance. Do you know him? Yeah, we've heard of him. Yeah. Do you know he was my pupil? He used to sit in the same chair that you sat in. And I taught him. Everything he knows is because of what I taught him. Yeah. And so as a teacher, then you can have huge influence, no power, but by teaching the truth, explaining things logically, coherently, based upon reason and evidence, helping people to learn to pursue and to love the truth, you can actually influence the world. Yeah. And often we just don't know through the words that we say to our children, to our next door neighbor, to anybody. We might change someone, and that person might go on to change the world. And so sometimes you think, oh, I don't have the power to make a difference in this world. But we shouldn't think of power. We all have the ability to change the world through the influence we can have upon the people that we meet every day. So it might be I remember we used to go around fundraising, humble fundraisers, going door to door. We met people, all kinds of people. And sometimes through the conversations that we had on those people, we changed those people. Those people were changed through the encounters that they had with us when we were going door to door, representing God and true parents, sharing people with the principle with people through our conversations. And we met all kinds of people, even though we were really humble, just going fundraising or maybe witnessing in our 20s. And we met people who may have gone on to change the world. And we don't even know the impact and the difference that we made in people's lives. And that's the most important thing, not to think, oh, I want to become the leader, I want to become a powerful people, but just to think, how can I make a difference in the world in which I live? How can I influence all the people that I meet every day in my life that will leave the world a better place? And that's, in that sense, we're all leaders. A leader is someone who has followers, not a person who's got a title. All the prophets in the Old Testament, not a single one was a leader. Not a single one had a title. Not a single one had a position. Yeah. But they were all leaders in a different sense. They all had huge influence, even though they had no formal position or authority. They all had huge influence, not just on their own community, but upon people who've been alive for thousands of years later, who've read their words. And that's the most important thing, really, is to leave the world a better place through what you say and through what you do. Anyway, so here we are. They set off now from Kadesh, and losing track of time as usual. And in the first month, the whole Israelite community arrived in the desert of Zin. And they stayed at, actually, this is really important. I'll take a break here. Okay, so this is an important event, which we also look at in quite a lot of depth and detail in the principle. In fact, if you read the principle book, it's astonishing how many pages are dedicated to this particular event. So let's have a look at it. In the first month, the whole Israelite community arrived at the desert of Zin, and they stayed at Kadesh. There Miriam died and was buried. Now there was no water for the congregation, and they assembled themselves against Moses and Aaron. The Lord said to Moses, "Take the rod and tell the rock before their eyes to yield its water." And then Moses goes in front of the congregation and he says to them, "Hear now, you rebels, shall we bring forth water for you out of this rock?" And Moses lifted up his hand and struck the rock with his rod twice, and water came forth. And the Lord said to Moses, "Because you did not believe in me to sanctify me in the eyes of the people, you shall not bring this assembly into the land I've given them." And the kind of thing is trying to understand, well, what happened here? What happened? It's kind of seems very harsh. So let's try and analyze this. First of all, let's have a look at what Moses said. "Hear now, you rebels." So obviously Moses has lost it with them. Yeah. The reality is, as we saw before, at the time of when they were all hungry, it wasn't everybody who was a rebel, but he was accusing them, "Hear now, you rebels." Yeah. He was accusing all the people of Israel of being rebels. And of course, that was very painful for them because they weren't all rebels. It was just some people, they were just thirsty. That's the reality. They were thirsty. They wanted to drink. But he said, "Hear now, you rebels." So that was painful for them to hear that. "Shall we bring forth water for you out of this rock?" So that's it, giving the impression here that he is the one who's going to do the miracle, bring the water out of the rock, as opposed to God bringing the water out of the rock. It's the second thing. And then he lifted his hand and struck the rock with his rod twice, and water came forth. Again, if we go back, we'll see here that God didn't tell him to strike the rock. God said to him, take the rod and tell the rock before their eyes to yield its water. So God said to Moses, speak to the rock, not strike the rock, speak to the rock. So instead, he struck the rock twice and water came out. So, okay. So first of all, he's obviously lost it here. Why is he reacted in this kind of way? Why is it that he wasn't able to manage his emotions? Why isn't he wasn't in control of himself? What was it that changed? Yeah, such that he wasn't able to manage the situation. He faced far worse situations. Korah's uprising, rebellion was far worse. All sorts of things were far worse, but he never lost his cool. Yeah. So why is it here? Well, the thing is here. There Miriam died and was buried. His older sister, who saved his life, who supported him all these years, his older sister died. So you can imagine then, Moses was grief-stricken. The one who he went to, who he could love and who he could trust wholeheartedly more than anybody else. He knew she would not stab him in the back. He would pour out his heart, all his struggles, all his difficulties, all his weaknesses, all his doubts and everything to her. And he knew he could do that. And he knew she would never turn against him or use that against him. And she was the one who he relied on, his older sister, who saved his life when he was born. And now she died. So you can imagine then Moses was grief-stricken, in a state of complete grief. But the other thing is Miriam's looked at last week, I think. She was the one who did a lot of the practical stuff, organizing, networking, managing lots of things, water and all these sorts of things. Moses went on the mountain, brought down the commands, the word of God. But Miriam and Aaron was responsible for the priests, as a priest, for all that sort of side. And Miriam, as part of the team, her responsibility was doing much more of these sort of practical organizational things. Now she died, and Moses didn't know what to do. He didn't know how to get water. But more importantly, he was in a state of grief. And so that's why he wasn't able to manage the emotions. So that's why when they came to him wanting water, he didn't know what to do, spoke to God, and he lost it. And it's really sad. So all you can do is just feel compassion for Moses, in this incredibly difficult situation. And that's the reality. Leaders are human beings. They have their own emotional and personal life. And when they go through these kinds of things, one needs to give them space to be able to recover from these kind of experiences of incredible, intense grief. And anyway, so God said, because you did not believe in me to sanctify me, then the other thing is here, he struck the rock twice. So the first time God says strike the rock, so that's when they came out of Egypt. So when they came out of Egypt, they had a slave mentality. The only thing that would motivate them was a stick. And that's why they needed a stick to motivate them. Now they'd been to Mount Sinai, they'd met God, they experienced God's word, they made a covenant with God. And so now they needed a different kind of leadership, not a stick, but words of encouragement. And to engage in discussion, engage in argument, use words to inspire people, to help people to overcome this kind of thing instead of a stick. And, the principal interpretation is also kind of interesting. It says that when Moses struck the rock the first time, he was striking the fallen Adam. When he struck the rock the second time, he was striking the restored Adam. So how does that work? So again, it's a bit like, when you correct somebody. If you see somebody doing something wrong, you might need to correct them. And if you correct them in a good way, they'll be grateful for being corrected. But if you then go and hit them and hurt them, then you get damaged. So when Moses did it like this, he actually hurt their heart. It's very easy when you're in this kind of situation to just say something which hurts somebody really badly. And that's really important, those kind of situations. So I think that's what was going on here. But for me, the most amazing thing is, when did this happen? It could have happened just after they were going to the beginning of the 40 years, or it could have happened at the end of the 40 years. It's not clear, to be honest, from the Bible. If it happened at the beginning of this 40 years, what I find remarkable is that Moses, knowing he wasn't going to lead the people into the land of Canaan, still was willing to lead them for 40 years. Even though he wasn't going to get the reward of being able to settle down in the promised land himself, he was still willing to take up the task and to lead them for the next 40 years, even though he's 80 years old. And you have to think what extraordinary heart this man had. What an extraordinary person this man was. That even though he'd been basically told you failed, you're not going to take them in, he still led them for the next 40 years and guided them. It's the most amazing thing I've ever read, to be honest. It's very easy to judge Moses and say he made a mistake. But I think, he was a great man. Anyway, so eventually they arrived. So we're skipping for 40 years now because we don't have time. And then they arrived after 40 years at the land at the River Jordan, ready to enter the land of Canaan. And this time, there was two tribes, Reuben and Gad. They wanted to settle on the east bank of the Jordan. So the land of Canaan was supposed to be the west bank, the other side, the west bank of the River Jordan. So these two tribes, they were traveling around, they were on the east bank of the Jordan, and they saw that actually there was a lot of pasture there. They had lots of flocks of sheep and goats and everything else. And they thought to themselves, actually, we don't want to cross over the River Jordan. We just want to settle here on the east bank of the Jordan. Yeah, we don't want to cross over over the river. And so this is like a difficult point. Okay, so these two tribes, Reuben and Gad, was saying, the other 10 tribes, they can go ahead, they can cross over the River Jordan, they can fight all the battles, and they can settle down in Canaan. But we just want to stop here. Okay? So it could look like these two tribes are putting their own interests above that of the nation as a whole. And so Moses, in response to them, said, should your fellow Israelites go to war while you sit here? Is that fair? Is that just? Don't you remember what happened last time round? Yeah, when only two of the people that went to look at the land came back with a good report. Do we want to make the same mistake this time? So he just asked them a question. Should your fellow Israelites go to war while you are here? He didn't tell them what to do. He posed a question. Then they thought about it. Yes, that's not fair. He's right. It's not fair. So how can we come up with a solution to this problem? So the leaders of Reuben and Gad, the elders, had a conversation, and then they came back with a proposal to Moses. And they said to Moses, okay, you're right. What we'll do is this. We'll leave our cattle and our women and our children here on the east bank of the River Jordan, but all our men, they will go and fight until the land is conquered. They will join together with the other 10 tribes, but not only join together with the other 10 tribes, they'll take the leading role in the fight against the other Canaanite tribes. And only when all the other 10 tribes have been able to settle down will the men go back and cross over the Jordan again, back to the east bank of the River Jordan. So they came up with this compromise. And so again, that's really important. There we are. You can see they settled here, Gilead, Gad, and Reuben. They settled there on the east bank of the River Jordan. And so this is very important, again, sort of for leadership, is about, looking at things objectively and separating from the people from the problem. So he realized there's a previous episode. Moses realized there was a previous problem, the episode of the spies. Okay, so he's not saying to Reuben and Gad, you're bad, you're wrong, because you're just doing what they did. Let's just separate that and just let's look at things logically. And so Moses then focused upon the interests, not the positions. And, and then said to them, why don't you go back and invent an option for mutual gain? So Moses then, he recognized that actually, and he encouraged the leaders of Reuben and Gad to recognize. So Moses could see Reuben and Gad had a legitimate interest in wanting to stay on the east bank of the River Jordan because there was plenty of land there for their sheep and their goats and their cattle and everything. You could see they have a legitimate interest in that. But he wanted those two tribes to recognize that the other 10 tribes also had a legitimate interest, in fighting against the Canaanites. So he left it to them to come up with an option for mutual gain where both sides could benefit, and that's what it was. And so also their objective criteria, Reuben and Gad only to return after all the other tribes settled. So it was that kind of thing. So Moses didn't say, oh, we have to unite, therefore we all have to cross over. He was able to look at it objectively, and to see, yes, they have a legitimate objective reasons for why they want to do it. And they're willing to support the other 10 tribes as well. And so it's a win-win situation. And that's the best way to go about things, to recognize, there's two people with two different interests, to recognize what are the legitimate interests of both sides, and to find out, is there a compromise where both sides can be happy? It's not one side is right and the other is wrong, and they have to unite for the sake of it. But, okay, how can we find a way to take this forward in a peaceful way such that both sides' legitimate concerns are recognized? Again, you have to say, it's quite different to a lot of the kind of arguments that are going on in our world today, the world of cancel culture. We're right, you're wrong, you're canceled, or everybody has to agree with us because we're right. That's not the way. In Britain, we had these conflicts about whether Britain should be in the EU or leave the EU, and the society in Britain became very, very polarized between remain and leave. But, a better thing to do is to recognize that people arguing to leave the EU have a legitimate reasons why they want to do it. The people who vote for to remain in the EU, say all the people who want to leave the EU, they're all stupid, they're all uneducated, they're all nationalists, they're all racist, That's the accusation. And the people that leave accuse the people who want to remain in the EU of another list of things, And the point is, both sides are wrong in the way in which they characterize the other side. Both sides need to recognize each side has its legitimate concerns, and can we find a way in which both sides' legitimate concerns can be recognized, can be validated, and there's a compromise in which everybody can settle on and everyone can agree. So instead of both sides losing or just one side winning, find a way that both sides can win-win. Not easy. Anyway, so then Moses he knows he's not going to lead the people into the land of Canaan, but he's very concerned that they need a leader. He recognizes this. And so Moses said to God, let God, the God of the spirits of everyone living, set a man over this community to lead them, to show the way ahead, and to bring them back home so God's community will not be like sheep without a shepherd. So, leaders are necessary. You can't have an orchestra without a conductor, but a conductor by himself isn't much use. And more than one conductor is not much use either. You need to have a leader in order to get anything done. But at the same time, you need lots of other people as well. So, when Korah was saying all of the community of, all the Israelite community are holy, why we don't need a leader? Actually, he wanted to be the leader, but actually a leader is necessary. Because otherwise, who's going to coordinate everybody to get the task done? But the qualities of leadership are really important. Moses, we saw, is a very humble person. So the Lord said to Moses, take Joshua, a man in whom is a spirit, and lay your hand on him, have him stand before the priests and the entire assembly, and commission him in their presence. Give him some of your authority so the whole Israelite community will listen to him. And this is one of the most important things about leadership, is to make sure that there is a smooth and uncontested transition from one leader to the next. So I talked about this. This is really important. When a king dies, there are normally the oldest son becomes the king, unless there are other extenuating circumstances. And so Moses then realized, if I just die and nobody's been appointed the leader, it's going to be a disaster. They're just going to be fighting over who's going to be the next leader. Yeah. So one of the most important things is to appoint and the next leader and to gradually give this person your authority. So gradually Moses gradually transfers his authority to Joshua. So by the time Moses dies, it doesn't matter because Joshua is already running the whole show. And that's really important. If the chairman or chief executive or managing director of a business dies or is run over by a bus, everything should carry on as normal until a replacement is found. If everything just grinds to a halt or falls to pieces, that's a failure of leadership. Because a good leader sets up something that will run without him being there. Yeah, it'll just be a self-organizing. Everyone knows their role, they know their responsibility, they just do all the things they need to do until a replacement is found. And Moses did even better than that. He actually realized, appointed, it's not like a dictator. Dictators don't want to step down or retire until they die. But actually Moses gradually transferred all his authority to Joshua and publicly did that. So everyone recognized that, etc. Went through a ceremony for the transfer of leadership before he died. And then Moses gradually stepped back and no longer was the leader. And it was and so Moses stepped back from being a leader and then he just became a teacher. It was on the first day of the 11th month, the 40th year, that Moses addressed the people of Israel, telling them everything God had commanded him concerning them. So this is what we call the book of Deuteronomy. He just sat down and spent a month just talking to them, and explaining to them everything. And he wrote all these words that he wrote down, that forms the basis of the book of Deuteronomy. It's like partly a summary of everything that happened before. It's all, and also about what's going to happen in the future. And so this is what the scripture is. It's like teaching in a particular context. And so, Moses then, he knew that some of his greatest achievements would not last forever. The people he'd rescued would one day suffer exile and persecution again. The next time, though, they would not have a Moses to do miracles. So he planted a vision in their minds, hope in their hearts, discipline in their deeds, and a strength in their souls that would never fade. When leaders become educators, they change lives. So up until then, Moses led them out of Egypt, led them across the Dead Sea, led them to Mount Sinai, led them through the wilderness for 40 years, done this, that, and the other. They had been a great leader. But now he retired from that. Joshua became the leader, and now he just sat down and started just teaching and became a teacher. And because he realized, actually, I need to teach people so that we would say the principle, or so the word of God is living in their hearts, so they don't need me to tell them anything anymore, because they will find God's word living inside them. And one of the things, I haven't got this quote here, but anyway, Moses said to the people, if you want God's word and God's truth, you don't need to go to heaven. You don't need to say, who's going to go to heaven to find the truth for us? Moses said to them, you don't need for someone to go and cross the seas to find out the truth, because the word of God is living in your heart. He said that to them. That's where the word of God is dwelling, is living. And so he's teaching them in a way they could understand that. And often I say that the principle, you might think the principle is in the black book. The principle is not there. That's just a written expression of some aspects of the principle. When God created human beings, God wrote the principle into us. God wrote the word of God into us. Sometimes people say, well, God gave Adam and Eve a commandment, don't eat the fruit. How did God deliver that commandment? Was it through a loud hailer? Was it written down on a signpost somewhere? Did Lucifer deliver it? No, it was written into them. That's their conscience. They knew that. God wrote the commandment into them. Intuitively, instinctively, they knew the commandment. It was there written inside them, just like all this is written. That's my initial response when I heard the principle was, why didn't I, it's so obvious. Why didn't I think of it myself? So that's what Moses is doing here. And so Moses said to them, observe the commands of the Lord your God, walking in his ways and revering him. For the Lord your God is bringing you into a good land, a land with brooks and streams and deep springs gushing out into the valleys and hills, a land with wheat and barley, vines and fig trees, pomegranates, olive oil and honey, a land where bread will not be scarce and you'll lack nothing, a land where the rocks are iron and you can dig copper out of the hills. When you've eaten and are satisfied, praise the Lord your God for the good land he's given you. So for Moses then, this is the most important thing. They're going to go there, they're going to settle down, but Moses is reminding them, once you settle down and you start enjoying all this luxury and all the nice food, which is different to the food in the desert, once you start enjoying all these things, you settle down, you become prosperous, praise the Lord your God for the good land he's given you. Don't forget God. Yeah, it's so easy when people are in a difficult situation, they pray to God, they turn to God for help. When people settle down, they're prosperous, they're wealthy, they think, oh, we don't need God anymore. And they stop praying to God. I remember Father said that. Father said, you know, he wasn't worried about the time when we were all being persecuted. He said he's worried about the time when we weren't being persecuted. And so Moses said, be careful that you do not forget the Lord your God, yeah, when you settle down, failing to observe his commands, yeah, which is often what people do today in the prosperous West, his laws and his decrees that I'm giving you today. Otherwise, when you eat and are satisfied, when you build fine houses and settle down, and when your herds and flocks grow large, and your silver and gold increases, and all you have is multiplied, then your heart will become proud, and you'll forget the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. Yeah, that's always the temptation. He led you through this vast, so again, Moses reminding them of the story of why they're there. They shouldn't forget the story. They shouldn't forget the narrative. They have to remember why it is they're living in the land of Canaan instead of the land of Egypt as slaves. He led you through the vast and dreadful wilderness, that thirsty and waterless land with its venomous snakes and scorpions. He brought you water out of the hard rock. He gave you manna to eat in the wilderness, something your ancestors had never known, to humble and test you so that in the end it might go well for you. You may say to yourself, my power, my strength, and my hands have produced this wealth for me. But remember, the Lord your God, for it is he who gives you the ability to produce wealth, and so confirms his covenant, which he swore to your ancestors, as it is today. So it's so easy just to forget where we came from. It's so easy to forget how God has worked in our lives, not just as individuals, but as a family. And, sometimes people, and, looking back at our ancestors, I remember somebody said to me, he said, well, when he looks back, he doesn't want to tell his children about his ancestry because his ancestors came from the West Indies and they were slaves. He doesn't want to tell that. But I would said, well, actually, the Jews, they were slaves, but they never forget that. They always tell their children, once we were slaves in Egypt, and God brought us out of Egypt into this land. So yes, just remind your children that maybe their grandparents or their great-grandparents or great-great-grandparents were this or that, very poor background. Maybe they were slaves, maybe they were foreigners, but that, through God's grace, that is not our reality today. Yeah. And so the real test of a nation is not if it can survive a crisis, Often people survive wars, but if it can survive the lack of a crisis. Can it stay strong in times of plenty, power, and prestige? That is a challenge that has defeated every civilization known to history. The pages of history are littered with the relics of nations that seemed impregnable in their day, but which eventually declined and fell and lapsed into oblivion, and always for the reason Moses prophetically foresaw. They forgot. They forgot who they were. They forgot where they came from. They forgot how they came to be where they were. Memories fade. Same for us. Our spiritual community is exactly the same. Memories fade. People lose sight of the values they once fought for. The nation in its early battles over becomes strong. Some of its members grow rich. They become lax, self-indulgent, over-sophisticated, too intellectual. Talking about postmodernist stuff, decadent. They lose their sense of social solidarity. They begin to feel that such wealth and possession as they have is theirs by right. And you can say, yeah, that is a pretty accurate description of Europe today and the West generally. Yeah, forgotten where we came from. We've forgotten our roots. We've forgotten the stories. We've forgotten our history. Yeah, we've turned to other gods. We think it all depends upon the economy and everything like that. And yeah, as there's a book I just bought it 2 weeks ago actually, called Cultural Dementia. Yeah, people talk about dementia when people get old. This is cultural dementia, how the West has lost its history and risks losing everything else. Yeah, because we've forgotten. Nowadays, people don't believe, nowadays, lots of young people, they don't believe in freedom of speech anymore. Freedom of speech is now regarded as a right-wing idea. Yeah, because nowadays, a lot of people, they believe in cancel culture. We cancel people who we don't agree with because they're politically incorrect. Freedom of speech, oh, that's just a freedom for people who we disagree with, whose views we don't like, to be able to say the things that we don't like. We don't want freedom of speech because we don't want the people who we don't agree with to be able to express the views that they have. Yeah, because they're racist and they're fascist and they're sexist and they're transphobic and they're this and homophobic and they're that, and we think they should be silenced. Yeah. In other words, they think there should only be freedom for the people who have the same views that they have. They're the only ones who should be free to be able to express their opinion. That's cultural dementia. We've forgotten what it was like under fascism. We've forgotten what Europe was like under dictatorship. We've forgotten what Europe was like under fascism. We've forgotten what Europe was like under communism. We've forgotten why people died for freedom of speech and freedom of religion. We've forgotten those things. Yeah. It's shocking, honestly, it's shocking. You know, it's cultural dementia. So memory then, so the biblical view is that memory is the basis for ethics. Throughout history, there have been many attempts to ground ethics in universal attributes of humanity. So this is particularly since the Enlightenment. With the Enlightenment came the abandonment of the Bible as a source of authority for truth or ethics about what is right and wrong. So if you're going to abandon the Bible, then you have to find an alternative basis for ethics, deciding what is right and wrong. So Immanuel Kant based it upon reason and also upon duty. Yeah. Bentham, Jeremy Bentham, he said it rooted in consequences. In other words, something is good if it leads to the greatest happiness of the greatest number. Something is bad if it leads to the less happiness for a large number of people. David Hume attributed it to certain basic emotions: sympathy, empathy, compassion. That's the one most close to the biblical understanding, because it's about compassion and fellow feeling with others. Adam Smith predicated on the capacity to stand back from situations and judge them with detachment. You call it the impartial spectator. So you are detached. You don't judge things according to what's in my interest. You try and look at things objectively, what's in the best interest of everybody. So, but each of these has proved, none of these has proved fail-safe. Each of these has failed. Immanuel Kant, well, there were people in Nuremberg who defended their actions as Nazis based upon following Immanuel Kant's ideas about ethics, doing their duty. They did their duty, yeah? So you cannot judge them and say what they did was wrong. This also has all sorts of problems as well. All of these do. None of them's worked. And so Judaism, so the Hebrew Bible, though, it takes a different view. The guardian of conscience is memory. Civilizations begin to die when they forget. Only in Israel, the Hebrew Bible, and nowhere else, is injunction to remember felt as a religious imperative to an entire people. So over and over and over again, Moses says, remember. So that means you learn from experience. You remember all these things. You don't forget. You don't forget what it was that led to the rise of fascism. You don't forget that the Nazis passed, they're called enabling laws, to give the state the authority to do anything that it wanted to in an emergency situation. What's going on now in some countries, enabling laws have been passed, which gives the government to do anything that it wants to do to deal with the crisis of the coronavirus. The state has taken upon itself the authority to restrict people's liberty and to do all kinds of things without any laws being passed to do that. It's very shocking. People have forgotten all these things. Anyway, so after the death of Moses, the Lord said to Joshua, "Moses, my servant, is dead. Now then, you and all these people get ready to cross the Jordan River into the land I'm about to give to the people of Israel. As I was with Moses, so I'll be with you. I'll never leave you nor forsake you. Just be strong and courageous, because you'll lead these people to inherit the land I swore to their forefathers to give them. Be careful to keep all the laws my servant Moses gave you. Do not turn from it to the right or to the left. You may be successful wherever you go. Do not let this book of the Torah depart from your mouth. Meditate on it day and night, so you may be careful to do everything written in it. Then you'll be prosperous and successful." So he's saying to Joshua, always study the Torah, always read and study the books of the law from Moses. And that's when I talk about this next workshop, where Moses said, if you want to have a king, the first thing the king has to do before he starts ruling is he has to copy out the book of the law himself. He has to make his own handwritten copy of the book of the law. And then the king has to study the book of the law every single day. He has to read it. Why? Because the king doesn't have the authority to make laws. All the king has the authority to do is to enforce the laws, to enforce justice. Yeah. So in order to do that, he has to know the law, and also he has to live within the law and follow the law himself. And that's really important there, that we have religious leaders and spiritual leaders and political leaders who study the scripture. Yeah. Anyway, they all answered Joshua, "All that you've commanded us, we will do. Wherever you send us, we will go. Just as we listened to Moses in all things, so we will listen to you. Only may the Lord your God be with you, as he was with Moses. Only be strong and of good courage." So they are encouraging Joshua and saying they will support him. And then they send out 2 spies to go to the city of Jericho. And the 2 spies go out and they go around the city and to see how it was. And then the secret police in Jericho, they hear there's 2 spies, and the king of Jericho sends the police to capture these 2 spies, and the spies realize they're being trailed by the police, and so they run into a house in the wall of the city, and it happens to be the house of Rahab the prostitute, and they say to Rahab, "Could you hide us? Please hide us." And then Rahab says to them, "We all know about the God of Israel. We're all terrified. We've heard about what the God of Israel did to the Egyptians. We've heard about what the God of Israel did to all the people in whatever they were called, Ammonites, and we are frightened of you." Anyway, so she says, "I'll hide you. But when you get out of here, please protect my family." Anyway, so eventually the police come knocking on all the doors, and they knock on the doors of Rahab's brothel. And they say to Rahab, "We heard the spies came into your brothel. Are they here? Hand them over." And Rahab now had to make a choice. She had to choose. Is she going to hand them over and get a reward from the king of Jericho for handing over the spies? Or is she going to not hand them over? And of course, what would happen then if the police were suspicious and they went and searched her brothel and they found the 2 spies? Then of course, she and her family would all be put to death. So she has to make a choice. What is she going to do? So at the risk of her life and the life of her family, she says, actually, they were here, but they left not very long ago, and they went towards the gate. And if you're quick, you might be able to catch up with them. So she does that. And then they carry on hiding underneath one of the beds. When the night comes, they crawl out from underneath the bed, And Rahab says, right, I'll let you out of my window, which is in the wall by this red rope, but keep your promise. When Jericho falls, please protect me and my family. Sorry, that noise. And then they set out for Canaan. 3 days before they cross the Jordan, the ark crosses over the river. They spend 3 days before the Jordan fasting. Then the ark crosses the river. They take 12 stones from the river, representing the 12 tribes of Israel. They build an altar. All the people were circumcised because now they'd entered Israel, Canaan, they have to be circumcised. They celebrate the Passover. Then after they recovered from being circumcised, Joshua, they met the army of the Lord. So they had this encounter with all these angels, and then they went to Jericho, captured Jericho. 40,000 soldiers went along, 7 priests blowing the trumpets. I'm sure you remember this from Sunday school. And they circled the city 6 times. Then on the 7th day, they all shouted, and it says the walls came tumbling down, and they carried on. They defeated 31 kings in Canaan. And Rahab and her family were protected, and she became one of the ancestors of King David and thus Jesus. And so they went into Canaan, and dear, hang on a second, I've got to change this. Last bit. That slide's got out of, I need to set up here correctly. Set up, I don't know where it goes on to 224. So I just added a few extra slides so it didn't work properly. Okay. Almost there. There. And put it on current slide. And there we are. So they settle in Canaan, all the tribes. And you can see here Judah and Benjamin, they settle next to each other. So I talked about this during the last workshop. Judah and Benjamin are completely united together because of what happened there in front of Joseph. And this I'll talk about more in the next workshop, about the kind of government that they established. And the government, which the Israelites was a federation held together by no political authority. They had no king, but by the unity of race and faith, and founded not on physical force, like most nations of the world, but on a voluntary covenant. The principle of self-government was carried out not only in each tribe, but in every group of at least 120 families. There's neither privilege of rank nor inequality before the law. Monarchy was so alien to the primitive spirit of the community that was later resisted by Samuel. And then finally, Joshua, before he dies, after they defeated the Canaanites and they've all settled down, then Joshua gathers everybody together for a final speech before he sends them all to their hometown. Yeah, it's a final gathering together. It's interesting again to see what does he say to them. It's really interesting. He gathers all the tribes of Israel at Shechem, which is where Jacob had settled when he lived. He summoned the elders of Israel, its leaders, its judges and officers. They presented themselves before God. Then Joshua said to the entire people, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says." And again, he recounts the whole story. The whole story. Long ago, your ancestors lived on the other side of the Euphrates. They served other gods. Among them was Terah, the father of Abraham. And Terah, of course, was an idol maker. So he's reminding them of where they came from. Yeah, they shouldn't be proud of where they came from. Their ancestors were idol worshippers. But then God called Abraham. I took Abraham, your ancestor, from the other side of the Euphrates. So Abraham then and God is the root of who they are, of their culture and their civilization, their people. I led him around through the whole land of Canaan. I added to his descendants and gave him Isaac, and to Isaac I gave Jacob and Esau. I gave Mount Seir to Esau to take over, but Jacob and his sons went down to Egypt. Then I sent Moses and Aaron, and I plagued Egypt with what I did to them. After that, I brought you out. I brought your ancestors out of Egypt, and you came to the sea. The Egyptians chased your ancestors with chariots and horses to the Red Sea. Then they cried for help to the Lord. So he set darkness between you and the Egyptians, and he brought the sea down on them, and it covered them. With your own eyes you saw what I did to the Egyptians, and you lived in the desert then for a long time, 40 years. So he's reminding them of the whole story of how they came to be, so that they will pass on this story to their children. Yeah. Remember, that's what Moses said when they left Egypt. Love God, teach your children, and teach your children what God has done for you, the Exodus. We need to teach our children what God has done for us, where we came from, which might have been a very miserable situation, yeah, and how God saved us. Our lives are transformed through encountering the principal and true parents, how lineage was changed, how our family was established, how what God has done for us. We need to tell our children and our grandchildren what God has done for us, where we came from, and how we came to be here, having the qualification to recite the family pledge. Then you crossed over the Jordan. You came to Jericho when the citizens of Jericho attacked you. They were Amorites, Perizzites, Canaanites, Hittites, Girgashites, Hivites, Jebusites. They were the ones in Jerusalem. But I gave them into your power. It wasn't your sword or bow that did this. I gave you the land on which you hadn't toiled and cities that you hadn't built. You settled in them and you're enjoying the produce from the vineyards and olive groves that you didn't plant. So again, God is reminding them very, very clearly, I gave you Canaan. Why does God have the authority to give the land of Canaan to the descendants of Abraham? Because God created the universe. God owns the universe. God owns the world. God owns the land of Canaan. And as we talked about the other day, God tells the people, it's my land. You're just living on my land, but it's not your land. You know, you have to behave yourself when you're living in this country. Yeah. And so he's reminding them, you didn't plant these things. You're just enjoying the things that came from other people. So be grateful. So now revere the Lord. Serve him honestly and faithfully. Put aside the gods that your ancestors served beyond the Euphrates and in Egypt and serve the Lord. So of course he realizes some of them have brought these gods with them. Some have brought these bad habits with them. Some have brought these bad ways of behaving and bad ways of thinking and etc., etc. You know, it's very difficult to leave all this stuff behind. It's very difficult to leave all the spiritual, emotional, psychological baggage and all the sort of things that we rely upon as props to keep us going. It's very hard to let all these things go and just trust entirely upon God, yeah, and put aside all the old superstitions and things. So that's what Joshua's inviting them to do. But if it seems wrong in your opinion to serve the Lord, then choose today whom you will serve. That's remarkable, isn't it? Joshua is saying to them, you choose who you want to serve. Freedom of religion is at the fundamental basis of Israel. You choose whether you want to worship the God of Israel or if you want to carry on worshiping the old gods, these pagan gods. It's your choice. He's saying to them, I can't force you to worship the God of Israel. I can't force you to keep the commandments. I can't force you to do all these things. They all have to come from your heart. As when God said to the people building the tabernacle, accept everything for people who offering comes from their heart to build the tabernacle. It has to be an offering of heart. And Joshua's emphasizing this over and over again. Freedom of religion here. This is the earliest example of freedom of religion in human history. Yeah. Freedom of religion within a religion is unheard of. Choose the gods whom your ancestors served beyond the Euphrates, if you want to do that, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you live, if you want to do that. You can follow the local gods of the Canaanites, but my family and I will serve the Lord. In other words, it doesn't matter what you do, I and my family, we will worship and we will serve the God of Israel. That's our choice and that's our tradition. That's why the family pledge, our family, yeah, our family, owners of Chongaguk, this, and this, yeah. Makes sense? Same thing. This is our tradition. Then the people answered, God forbid. that we ever leave the Lord to serve other gods. The Lord is our God. In other words, what an unthinkable thing you're saying to us, Joshua. We can't even imagine going after other gods. He is the one who brought us and our ancestors up from the land of Egypt, from the house of bondage. He has done these mighty signs in our sight. He's protected us the whole way. We've gone in all the nations through whom we've passed. The Lord has driven out all the nations before us, including the Amorites who lived in the land. We too will serve the Lord because he is our God. Then Joshua said to the people, you can't serve the Lord. Huh? That's shocking, isn't it? He doesn't say great. He says, no, you can't serve the Lord because he's a holy God. Yeah, he's challenging them. I remember so many times when Father said things and we said yes, then Father challenged us. No, I don't think you're going to do that. Yeah, he is a jealous God. I didn't talk about that. I should have talked about that. I don't have time this time. He won't forgive your rebellion and your sins. If you leave the Lord and serve foreign gods, then he'll turn around and do you harm and finish you off, in spite of having done you good in the past. Because if you don't observe the law within the land will cast you out. And then the people said to Joshua, no, you're wrong. The Lord is the one we will serve. So there's this kind of argument, this kind of discussion, this kind of emphasis, wanting to make this pledge over and over again. So Joshua said to the people, you're witnesses against yourselves. You've chosen to serve the Lord. In other words, you can't say you didn't say that. And they said, we are witnesses. So now put aside your foreign gods. Again, he's saying that to them. That are among you. Focus your hearts on the Lord, the God of Israel. And that's always a heart relationship with the God of Israel. And the people said to Joshua, we will serve the Lord our God and we will shema him. We will listen to him. We will obey him. We will observe all the commandments that he's given to us. And on that day, Joshua made a covenant for the established just rule for them at Shechem. And Joshua wrote these words in God's instruction scroll. Then he took a large stone and he put it up there under the oak in the sanctuary of the Lord. And Joshua said to all the people, this stone will serve here as a witness against us. Yeah, so whenever you see this stone, you'll remember the promise that you made, because it has heard all these words that he spoke to us. It'll serve as a witness against you in case you aren't true to your God. Then Joshua sent the people away, each to his own legacy. In other words, sent them all away to their hometown to put into practice all the things that they promised to do. And that is the end. So we don't need to meet on Monday. I'm glad I was able to get there. Anyway, for me, this is really very touching, this emphasis over and over again. We have to understand who we are, and who we are is the story of which we are a part. Over and over again. That's why Father, over and over again, his speeches, he'd be reciting the history of God's providence, over and over again, because he wanted to remind us who we are. We are of God's lineage. This is our ancestry. This is the providence. This is a story of which we're a part. And if you understand where you've come from, then you understand where you should be going. And this is the point. If you don't know where you've come from, then you don't know where you should be going. And this is the challenge, I would say, that our own spiritual community faces in terms of our second and third generation, I would say, really.